I'm Amanda Anderi, CEO at Funders Together. We're so glad you took the time to join us today, as we know many in philanthropy have questions and concerns around the budget and working with Congress and the administration. Today's webinar is going to focus on a few different things related to policy efforts, including a recent meeting Funders Together joined with HUD Secretary Ben Carson, the FY17 budget and what it means for FY18, and some advocacy action steps philanthropy can take. A few housekeeping items before we get started. All participants are on mute and will remain on mute throughout the presentation. If you have a question during the presentation, you can type it into the question box on your webinar panel, which is located on the right-hand side of your computer screen. That question box looks like this. You can enter a question at any time, but we will save content-related questions for the end of our panelist presentations. Finally, this presentation will be recorded. Because we want this to be a space for candid discussion among funders, this presentation will only be made available to Funders Together members on the past events page of our website. You will have to log in to view the recording. If you have any trouble doing so, you can email Lauren at funderstogether.org. Before we get started, I know we have a few people on the call who may not be familiar with Funders Together. We are a national network of over 200 foundations and united ways working to expand philanthropy's impact and influence to advance the movement to prevent and end homelessness. We do that through encouraging and supporting our members in risk-taking and learning faster together, inspiring by connecting members doing critical work across the United States to each other, as well as members with a local focus to national efforts, highlighting available opportunities for funders to be a part of policy change and bring the collective philanthropic voice to advocacy at both the local and national level. And finally, provide tailored learning that allows philanthropy to consider their role in best practices and emerging topics around preventing and ending homelessness. Now, before we get started, I'd like to take a quick poll to get a sense of what everyone on the call is doing in terms of advocacy efforts. We know some people on the call are representing philanthropy-serving organizations, so please answer with your members or with any discussions you've had within your organization in mind. And you can just go ahead and click the answers to the poll and we'll display them. All right, next poll. I think, Lauren, if you're ready. And here's our results. So that's great that we have a lot of people who participate in advocacy or education efforts. Next poll. This is a question around, does your foundation or United Way fund advocacy or education efforts? All right, let's see where we are there. Well, that's great. We have a number of people who fund education or advocacy efforts, and we know there's people who don't fund it but are curious about funding it, and people who want to learn more about funding it, and this is a great webinar to start, and we'll have more opportunities to learn about that in the future. So Funders Together's work is particularly important now more than ever as our political environment is in a state of rapid change. Over the past 8 years, we've been fortunate enough to build strong relationships with the federal government and create innovative public-private partnerships. But there's obviously a change in administration, and we believe now more than ever the philanthropic community must stand up and be strong leaders at the local, state, and national level. So throughout 2017 and beyond, we plan to advocate on behalf of the homelessness field, provide opportunities and tools for our members to engage in advocacy, and help maintain a focus on transformative system-level best practices. We have a number of resources for our members around that. We have a page dedicated to working with the new administration. It's updated regularly. It has talking points for philanthropy and working with the congressional and administrative staff, as well as resources as we become aware of new things developing in the budget, appointments to HUD, for example, as well as any other updates we feel are pertinent to help you in your education and advocacy resources. And those links are being sent in the chat box, and we will also send them out in the email post this webinar. We've also done previous webinars on the funder's role in advocacy and for a resource of legal limitations on lobbying for philanthropy. Now to get to the meat of the conversation. We were fortunate enough to be invited by the National Alliance to End Homelessness in a meeting that they scheduled with Secretary Carson to represent philanthropy's voice. Nan Roman was gracious, who's the CEO, was gracious to invite me, and I'd like for her to give first a perspective on how that meeting came about, what were the goals and purposes of bringing that meeting together, and any observations she's had before I give my observations. Nan?
Yes, can you hear me, Amanda?
Sound great.
Okay, thanks. Well, this was just a meeting that the National Alliance to End Homelessness requested of Secretary Carson as soon as he was confirmed. And I was joined in that request by one of my board members who's a former Secretary of HUD, Secretary Henry Cisneros. And we had just really wanted, I think, to see where the Secretary stood on homelessness and to try to get homelessness on his agenda to make sure that he knew where we stood as a country on homelessness, what HUD's role was and how important HUD's role was. And I know, speaking for Secretary Cisneros, that was a major agenda item of his, that he wanted to make the pitch to Secretary Carson that for a department whose name starts with housing, the number one priority should be helping those who didn't have housing. And we had, based on what we had heard about Secretary Carson, we wanted to take a few people with us to that meeting, including someone from the faith community to talk about their role, which Secretary Carson seemed to value, and what the faith community can and can't do. We had wanted to take with us a doctor. We ended up, we invited Mitch Katz from, Dr. Mitchell Katz, who's the head of the Los Angeles Department of Health Services. He was unable to come on the date that we ended up getting, but the person who does his housing work for him in Skid Row came, Mark Trotz. We wanted to have someone from philanthropy to talk about the role of philanthropy and what philanthropy could and couldn't do. And of course, who better for that than Amanda to join us. And then we also had a young woman who was homeless when she was a child and a youth. She now works for the Virginia Department of Housing, but to talk about how the programs, what kind of impact the programs had on her when she was young and homeless. As to what came out of it, I would say that it was mostly information sharing. The Secretary expressed, we talked about the affordable housing crisis. He talked about the need for services as well as housing. People on our group responded to that. He indicated that that housing would be, as he has indicated before, that we shouldn't worry so much about the HUD budget because housing was going to be covered in the infrastructure bill. And he indicated his willingness to work with us on moving forward on homelessness. I don't think there were any very specific commitments made, but it was a very congenial meeting, and he was very welcoming and open, I would say. Amanda, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, Nan, I absolutely agree with you. I think that it was important for us to have a diverse group of people there. He definitely responded to the people in the room who connected health and housing, who have experienced homelessness and recognize housing as a way that they were able to move forward with their lives. I think that there was obviously a concern right after our meeting, and from philanthropy's point of view in the meeting, I tried to press what were our constraints, that philanthropy definitely can't fill in the gaps, but highlight where we've had strong partnerships and leverage public funds. And I think he's made some comments afterwards that lead us to believe that there's still a feeling that private dollars are going to be important in his work going forward, which I know they are, but some concern about how that will work in terms of public-private partnerships. So what I took away from the meeting was that there's a lot of education to continue to be done, and as you said before, every secretary needs education, and I think that philanthropy will play a particular role in ensuring and that he knows like what exactly we're doing in communities, our limitations on filling in gaps, but also the dependency that philanthropy has in knowing that HUD and other government agencies are going to be a partner at the table. I was encouraged that he was reading books around poverty and that he seemed that he had important takeaways from his listening tour. And I felt encouraged that his staff was listening around the role of philanthropy and wanted to have subsequent meetings with us. And I think later on in the conversation, Nan, I'll ask about some appointments that happened after our meeting with him. Any other observations, Nan?
No, I think that sums it up. I might also just mention very briefly that we also met with Secretary Shulkin. Amanda wasn't in that meeting, but we also had a very positive meeting with Secretary Shulkin, who's the VA secretary. That meeting was with our leadership council, which is about a dozen people who run, city people or county people that run the homeless systems. And although he did say that homelessness was not his #1 priority at the VA, that suicide prevention was his #1 priority, he said that the work on ending homelessness among veterans was a signature, he felt was a signature accomplishment of the agency, that they used it all the time to show what could be done and how VA could work collaboratively with communities. And he absolutely expressed his intention to continue the effort and to work with other secretaries to do that. So it's a positive meeting.
Thank you, Nan, and thank you for including philanthropy in that meeting, and we might get into more discussion. Nan, I often hear you say that it's important to think about working with the administration, but it's also important to think about the money that the administration controls. And so I think that we'll move into our next part of the discussion on the federal budget. And joining us, we have Sarah Michelson from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, who will be joining Nan today to talk about their perspectives around the federal budget, working further with the administration, and any insight they have on their priorities. So let's just take a step back. From your perspective, Nan, if we can start with you, what happened with the FY17 budget agreement and its impact on homeless programs?
Sure, and maybe I should just say for those who don't know that the National Alliance is a national organization devoted to ending homelessness. We're not a membership organization, and we accomplish our goal through using data and research to figure out the best solutions and then trying to get federal policy that supports those solutions. And we also do capacity building in local communities. So the FY17 budget, remember, is the budget that should have begun on October 1st last year. So we're, most of the way through FY17, ends the end of September. And the budget was passed a few weeks ago. In terms of homelessness, and I think Sarah will talk to you about the housing parts of the budget, but in terms of homelessness, the most notable thing in the budget was that there was an increase of $133 million to the HUD homeless program, so that's the continuum of care programs. That increase of $133 million, much of it will actually have to go to to fund renewals, because the cost of renewing existing programs goes up every year. So a chunk of it will go for that. There will be another round of youth demonstrations, which is likely to be similar to the last round, $43 million for that. There's $12 million for data analysis. It's not clear exactly how that's going to be spent, but it's meant to help communities do a better job of utilizing their data. They may focus on some communities that haven't been doing so well with that. That will be a one-time only investment, so it's not a continuing funding. And there's $40 million in the poetically named Losers Fund. And that is a fund, in the last couple of rounds, they have really been disincentivizing transitional housing and incentivizing performance. And some communities have done a really poor job of ranking, of understanding how to rank their programs so that they can keep getting as much resources from HUD as they were. By not, they haven't put the higher priority programs at the top of the list, and so they've lost money. And one of the most notable of such communities was Miami-Dade, and whose member of Congress is an important person in the Appropriations Subcommittee. So this is money that the appropriators put in to sort of make those communities whole, but basically they'll have to spend most of it probably on rapid rehousing. HUD also got $10 million for probably about 1,200 new FUP vouchers. Those vouchers don't have to be targeted to homeless families or youth, but they could go to homeless families or youth, so that's something to think about. And HUD also got $40 million for about 6,500 new HUD VASH vouchers for veterans. So HUD did pretty well. USICH was extended for a year to the end of FY18, and it got its budget. Moving forward, there are some efforts in Congress to make the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness permanent. On the other hand, the administration has indicated that it wants to eliminate the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness. HHS did not do quite so well on the homeless specific programs. As HUD did, the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program stayed the same in funding at $119 million. The PATH program, which funds mental health outreach, stayed the same at $20 million. A program which a lot of communities use, the Safe and Stable Housing, the Safe and Stable Families program, went down $20 million. The SAMHSA grants for the benefit of homeless people, which is a lot of services dollars for people with disabilities, also went down $5 million. And other programs stayed the same. The VA programs, we don't get the breakdown of those, but I think that those did well. What's important to know about the 17 budget is that we shouldn't think that because we did fairly well on that in terms of homelessness that was anything to get complacent about. This was really a budget that was an artifact of a messed up congressional season. It was the budget itself was negotiated by the previous Congress. This Congress has been very busy confirming secretaries and repealing the ACA, and then the president told them that he wanted to make huge cuts in this budget, and basically I think they just couldn't deal with all of that, and they didn't have time to renegotiate the 17 budget, so they just took the old one and passed it. So that worked out great for us on the homeless side, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything good for 18, which I know we're going to talk about in a minute. And what it means to homelessness is that HUD can cover all the renewals and maybe do some new projects, maybe about 10 million in new projects. It means that HUD VASH is in really good shape. We should, at the end of this, we should have somewhere around 95,000 HUD VASH vouchers total, and HUD has also instructed PHAs that they should be sure to, when people exit the program, they should be sure to reissue them to new homeless veterans, and that will be covered to the degree that it's available through HUD shortfall funding. VA is in really good shape, and HHS, which is a smaller funder and has some leadership issues in terms of the programs there, or there's no leadership in the department there, rather is, has just held its own, but I think it will, when we get to 18, we can talk about how HHS will come out. I think that's a summary, Amanda, on the homeless side.
Thanks so much, Nan. Sarah, what happened on the housing side?
Great. Well, I think Nan really did a really good job of talking a little bit about the overview of the dynamics that were at play. And I just want to reiterate what she had said, which is that, this year, for the most part, HUD got along fine, especially in light of what could have been, what the threats were. But we see a much bigger threat coming over the horizon for the FY18 budget. So for this budget, on the whole, HUD programs were funded at either the level that was in the House or Senate bills and their draft bills. For the most part, those numbers on the whole, again, are either level funding from last year or a slight increase above it. The concern that we have going forward is really about the dynamic that's at play with President Trump and his proposal to cut non-defense programs across the board. And so in FY18, we've seen that he's called for increasing defense spending by $54 billion, but cutting everything else to really make up for that. And so we've estimated that that would lead to, or they've identified at least, that would be about a 15% cut to HUD programs when you compare it to this year's funding that Congress just completed. It would eliminate a lot of resources that are given to states and communities in terms of flexible funding that they use to address their community development needs and their housing needs. But it would also likely lead to about 200,000 families losing access to their rental assistance. And this is really a lifeline that folks use to stay in housing that they can afford, and without it, they would be at a very high risk of either facing evictions and, in worst cases, homelessness. And so, like Nan said, this year I think things went through pretty well. I think the White House waited too late into the game to start negotiating over spending levels, and by the point that they did want to start negotiating, both the House and Senate Republicans and Democrats had already sorted out their bills and weren't eager to kind of go back and refight those fights. But we'll see about what's going ahead in the future. There's a lot of different dynamics at play, including I think the president will be much more interested in making sure that he gets a win out of his budget in 18 than he did in 17, and that might pose more of a risk for something like a government shutdown or more disagreements among Congress.
All right, so we've definitely jumped into the FY18 portion of our conversation. A couple weeks ago when we were doing some Hill visits with our partners, we tried to stress that FY17 should be the baseline for FY18. And I think among both parties, they definitely expressed concern about the sequester amounts and the spending limits that would impact their ability to move forward with a robust FY18 budget. So I'd love for you to, both of you, Nan and Sarah, to talk a little bit about your perspectives on your concerns for FY18 and what some of your priorities are.
Well, I can start. So the
Great.
administration, oh, sorry, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. The administration's 18 budget proposal is supposed to be out on May 22nd or 23rd, unless Sarah's heard something different. And as she said, it's likely to be extremely grim, with huge cuts to HUD and HHS. Possibly not any cuts to VA. So, I mean, at this point, VA spending on homeless veterans is, I'm forgetting the exact number, but I think it's well over $1 billion, $1.4 billion, not including HUD-VASH, which of course goes through HUD. So it's sizable. So that's good. We don't have any indication about the 18 budget, as I said, because in terms of what it might do to homelessness, because there wasn't anything in the administration's proposal about that. There have been some indications to us that they're not inclined to cut homelessness, but on the other hand, if they cut all the other things that Sarah mentioned, we can have big problems there. But as most administration budget proposals are, that budget is likely to be dead on arrival in the Congress. Sarah explained about the, where we are on the caps. I mean, what I've heard recently, and again, Sarah may have have more current information, is that the Congress plans to go forward under the caps, that is, with retaining the caps, to do their budget, and the hope is they'll create a budget under the reactivated budget caps, and that's going to cause these massive cuts. And frankly, I think they're looking for a ton of pushback from the many constituencies, including the defense interests, that will scream when the budget comes in under the caps, in the hopes that then they'll be able to, as they did 2 years ago, lift the caps and do a more sensible budget. But that's counting on all of us to push back, and that's that's hoping is not where we would want to be. I don't think we know, I don't think it's at all clear where housing or homelessness are going to come out in these things. Of course, if the pie is smaller, we're going to be really fighting against our friends for money. Even if the pie is a little bit bigger, we're still going to be fighting. So I don't know. In terms of us, Sarah, do you want to add anything before I go into priorities? Did I say anything that I said that was incorrect, or do you have more information or thoughts about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you gave a really good overview. I have the same information about timing for when the president's budget will come out. I think, our biggest concern is that, like you mentioned, it really will take an all hands-on-deck approach to encourage Congress to lift the spending caps that are in place, to provide equal relief for both defense programs and non-defense programs. And that, our fear, at least with the president's budget that he puts out, is that it might be just so extreme with such deep cuts, then all of a sudden maybe the cuts that are half as deep feel like they're a good compromise. And that's really not where we want the goalpost to be. So we're focusing our message on the need to lift the spending caps, so that we can fully fund HUD programs. The only thing else I'll add is that what's unique about HUD programs is that most of the funding provides rental assistance, and that's a program that responds to what's happening in the private market. So when you see rents increasing in communities across the country, so does the cost to maintain a family with their rental assistance. And so even flat funding is something that is problematic for HUD programs. And typically they need last year they needed at least another $1.5 billion just to maintain current funding levels, and existing contracts for rental assistance. So as Nan mentioned, we don't want to get in a position where HUD programs are really fighting against one another, or we're picking and choosing one program over the other. Our goal really is to increase the pie available, and there are a couple of ways to do that, but the most immediate way is really to lift the spending cap.
All right, thank you very much for that perspective. So do you all want to talk about any of your priorities for FY18 in terms of the budget and working with the administration?
Well, I can say I think we'll be involved in the general budget advocacy, but in terms of our priorities, we'll, naturally be focused on the biggest pots of money. So that will be HUD. HUD, I think, is an agency, and an agency budget is going to be vulnerable generally. So that's $2.4 billion. That's the biggest amount of money that's targeted to homeless assistance. So that'll be a big focus for us. HHS is only about $253 million. We will certainly work on the HHS funding, but that'll be, that's probably less so because we have limited resources. And VA we will attend to. That's $1.6 billion overall, but it's in relatively good shape compared to the others. We'll also keep working on the Medicaid stuff and on housing more generally, as I said. And I would just mention, too, that we're going to be doing more local organizing. We used to do a lot of that. We sort of stopped in the past couple of years. It didn't stop, but slowed down a bit because Congress was really not doing anything except for appropriations, but now these money issues are absolutely paramount, and we're going to be doing more of that, and also focusing much more on public sector partners, and to try to get them to also advocate around these issues. We also have some priorities with the administration. I don't know if you want me to talk about them now or come back to that.
Please do, Nan.
All right, well, with HUD, you raised, Amanda, you know, we have our concerns also. Money is the number one thing, but we're also concerned about about changing some approaches. So there's some concern about the ability to keep a housing first focus. There's some concern about permanent supportive housing because long-term programs are not as popular. I'm just talking about the homeless programs now. We're concerned about what we're seeing is the communities that have low barrier programs, or enough low barrier programs, that is programs that don't have a lot of requirements to get in and don't have a lot of requirements for people to stay in. Those communities do better in terms of reducing the number of homeless people, but we're worried about low barrier, holding on to those low barrier approaches. And we're also concerned that the Secretary seems to discuss services a lot, and we do think people need services, but HUD is a terrible services funder. It doesn't really know how to fund services. It doesn't know what good services are. It doesn't evaluate services. So we need HUD to pay for the housing and for the Secretary to partner with HHS on the services, or someone. We're also worried about work requirements and keeping it a priority. Veterans, it's just really about staying the course. HHS, we haven't really been talking to that much because the Secretary is very focused on repealing the ACA, and his number one priority, I guess, is childhood obesity. And so we're not seeing our stuff being a big priority there, but when we get to the appointments there, I think there's some possibilities there at HHS as well.
Thanks, Nan. And I think, you know, one of the things that has stuck with me after our meeting with Secretary Carson was the first thing he said when he sat down is, we can't just house everyone. And I think over reflection, he was thinking about working on the whole person. And we know that's important, but I think all of us wanted to stress that housing is the first step in working on the whole person. And so that continues to be a priority and a concern of ours as well.
And HUD, and we need HUD to do the housing because HHS is going to do it, or that's for sure, or VA.
Yeah, absolutely. Sarah, can you share any of your priorities in the budget or working with the administration? I know you've also had some meetings at the White House and at other cabinet levels, and any perspective you want to share as well.
Yeah, absolutely. On the budget side, our focus is always on the programs that serve people who have the greatest needs and who have the lowest incomes. But to do that, we, like Nan had mentioned, we're also trying to focus as much as we can on local advocacy. We work with a coalition, the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding. It's a large coalition of about 75 national organizations that have a stake in the HUD budget. And we're working through them and with local mayors to plan a day of action in late July, hoping to raise more attention about the importance of housing and the need to not just fund the programs at equal levels for the FY18 budget, but to go bigger and bolder on that. But we're working on other campaigns too to try to find funding or to increase resources for affordable housing. And I think the biggest two opportunities are really with tax reform and with GSE reform, both of which we're working with the White House and members of Congress on right now. For tax reform, we've relaunched our United for Homes campaign, which seeks to make modest changes to the mortgage interest deduction so that it better serves more low and moderate income homeowners, but also produces savings that we can reinvest back into affordable rental housing for people who have the greatest needs. The interesting thing there is that really all of the resources that we talk about and we fight to protect at HUD and USDA are really just a quarter of all of the dollars that the federal government spends on housing. 3/4 of the money goes to some of the highest income households through the mortgage interest deduction and other homeownership tax breaks. And so from our perspective, just making some modest changes to rebalance and reprioritize how we're spending dollars can make a really big difference without adding any cost to the federal government. And so we're doing a lot of work across the aisle and with the White House, as I mentioned, on that. We've been talking to Mark Calabria, who is now with the Vice President's office, the chief economist there, and Paul Ryan's office to talk to them about what smart reform would look like and how that could be included in any tax bill that they move forward with. But there are also other opportunities. We know that Congress has to address housing finance reform soon in the coming year. And the last time Congress worked on this, the bill that moved the furthest had provisions in it that would expand the National Housing Trust Fund, which is a new program that is really deeply targeted to serve people who have the lowest incomes, serves people with extremely low incomes. So there's an opportunity there, too, to also see a big increase in resources. So even though this is a time of a lot of uncertainty and certainly a lot of risks on the budget side, we are working to find opportunities where we can to increase resources elsewhere. And then the last thing I'll mention in terms of priorities is, as Nan mentioned, we're deeply concerned about some of the reforms that the administration might be seeking in terms of housing programs, like adding work requirements and time limits. We've seen this before with efforts in welfare reform in the 90s, and it really led to even greater levels of people living in extreme poverty. And so we're very concerned that Congress might be trying to move down this road again, and we need to be educating them about what the impact really would be.
Thank you, Sarah. You know, one of our priorities that we list in our memo to Congress and the administration is also the low-income housing tax credit incentives. I know that a lot of people in philanthropy are particularly concerned about tax reform and that incentive being taken away in order to develop affordable housing. So we will also, I know you all are too, and so we'll be prioritizing with that and working with Congress. We actually had a lot of questions around that. I know some in philanthropy are particularly concerned about the tax deduction, but we as funders who are concerned around affordable housing and ending homelessness really want to emphasize the opportunities that have been created to solve homelessness through the low-income housing tax credit.
Absolutely. We see those as being very closely related. The work we've done, for example, around United for Homes, we've been working with Representative Keith Ellison, and he's introduced a bill that would make the changes that we're looking to for the mortgage interest deduction, and then would reinvest it back into the low-income housing tax credit, the housing trust fund, resources to repair public housing, which is an important asset for many communities, as well as rental assistance. So we're taking a broad look at where those resources could go, including the low-income housing tax credit. I will say that there's thankfully a lot of very good bipartisan support for the low-income housing tax credit. So I think while nothing is certain, it seems to be on relatively good footing.
Good. And speaking about good footing, I don't think it would be great for us to leave without sharing some good news and where we see some hope in working with the new administration. So Nan, I know we've had concern about, Secretary Carson's understanding around affordable housing and homelessness, but the president has recently made some appointments that I think, especially particularly in philanthropy, are excited about because there's some people who come from philanthropy. Do you mind talking about the two appointments that he's made that relate to homelessness and your perspective on that?
No, I wanted to mention one quick thing first, if I could, Amanda, and that is we also had a meeting with the OMB, and one of the things that came up there is something to think about. There was recently OMB released the Memorandum for Heads of Executive Departments and Agencies, Comprehensive Plan for Reforming the Federal Government and Reducing the Federal Civilian Workforce. And that directive from OMB is basically asking every cabinet secretary and department executive department head to do a strategic plan about how to cut and consolidate programs and what the department and reduce duplication and so forth, and how the department can move forward. And the person at OMB recommended to us that we, we have had goals around ending homelessness through opening doors during the Obama administration, and those were tremendously effective, having goals with timelines around all these subpopulations. We're not going to get, it's not going to work to try to get the same thing again, because no administration wants to do the same thing the previous administration did. But it was suggested to us that a more straightforward and simpler goal around homelessness would be good to try to get several of these departments to include in this planning exercise. They have to turn in their first iteration of it by June 30th, I think, and then there are several others as they craft the president's budget and strategy. So I just wanted to mention that as something that we're going to be working on, and something I think is worth thinking about with your other partners. In terms of sub-cabinet appointments, I think the person from philanthropy you're referring to is Pam Patnode, who has been running the Terwilliger Foundation and has been active with probably some of the people on the phone through some different housing affinity groups in philanthropy. She's somebody who's worked at HUD for quite a while. She was the Assistant Secretary of Community Planning and Development in the second Bush administration. At the end of the administration, that is the part of HUD that oversees the homeless programs. She then was at the Urban Land Institute, and she then was the director of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Housing Commission that I served on, and others. And now she runs the Terwilliger Foundation. Very familiar with housing, very familiar with HUD, very smart cookie, and I think someone will have access to and help from. So that's exciting. Also, Neil Ratcliffe has been nominated, not formally, I guess, but I guess there's a whole set of iterations of what it means to be nominated. In any case, he's been nominated, I'll just say, as Assistant Secretary of CPD, that same role I just said Pam had. He is from Houston. He ran the housing department there. He's a housing attorney. He's evidently fantastic, so I think that's a really good one. And Brian Montgomery, who was the FHA commissioner, I think before, wasn't he, Sarah? But he's been nominated as FHA commissioner. And he's also served in the Bush administration and seemed fine. Also, Clarence Carter has been chosen to run the TANF program at HHS. He was at HHS. We know him from HHS. In the Bush administration, he ran the community services, the block grant programs. Then he was the head of human services for the District of Columbia, and he then went to Arizona, where he ran the Department of Human Services and TANF. He's somebody that I've known for a long time too, so I think that's actually a hopeful appointment as well. Sarah, I don't know if there are others that I don't know about.
No, I think you named all the ones that I've known about. I just say we're really looking forward to Pam being confirmed. We've actually just today sent out a letter of support to the Senate Banking Committee to let them know that we're looking forward to working with her, since she has such great experience and deep knowledge of these programs.
Great. Thank you so much, Nan and Sarah. Now we're going to open it up to questions that you have on anything that we've just talked about. As mentioned, you may enter your questions on the question box or your webinar panel, which is located on the right-hand side of the computer screen. Lauren, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. We have one, and I think it's referring back to the meeting with Secretary Carson. Was there a conversation about housing for those who want to help themselves versus housing first in the most vulnerable population?
I don't think that was specifically something that came up, was it, Amanda?
No, not that I remember. I mean, I think that he's talked a lot, and I think this was at our meeting and other conversations about getting people out of programs. And so there was not specific mention, though, about housing the most vulnerable. I do think that he did at the end kind of make a not a strong commitment, I don't want to say that, but he understood that, there's some people who can't afford their own housing, and that there's a responsibility. I don't know that he was saying necessarily the government, but there's a responsibility to focus on housing those folks. So
that's true. I think he said also people with disabilities.
yeah,
It was not a very specific issue kind of conversation.
right. All right, well, you all are thinking of questions. We want to take another poll around, have your grantees express concerns around the proposed federal budget? All right. I think that it's pretty obvious there that there's a lot of concern and uncertainty. Are you working directly with your grantees to develop new advocacy strategies? All right. All right, about 50-50 there. And has your organization done advocacy or education efforts around the budget in the past or currently thinking through it now? And this is specific to the budget. Okay. Great. So one of the things that we wanted to give you examples around, because I know, as indicated by the poll even, that there's some hesitancy around how exactly philanthropy can work in educating or advocating with congressional members as well as policymakers. We'll be getting into more of the legal limitations around lobbying in a future webinar that I will mention, but we wanted to give some examples about how our members have done some work with us and on their own to educate their members of Congress. So the Simmons Foundation in particular has been doing responsive advocacy grants. I think the way Kelly Jackson describes it as emergency advocacy grants and being responsive to their community's needs and not waiting for their regular grant cycle. And I know that a lot of our members are thinking about that as a possibility, and I think that is one example that we would like to hear more about and how that's working, and we might do future series around that. After we had several meetings with congressional staff members a couple of weeks ago, we contacted foundations in particular areas where we had strong support or encouragement, and several of our members then agreed to do thank you notes, including Miami Homes for All and Sisters of Charity, to just re-emphasize some of the points we make, and particularly Sisters of Charity agreed to organize a meeting of their fellow colleagues in philanthropy, not to do particular lobbying, but of course just to educate members of Congress of what they're funding, unique public-private partnerships, what's working well in their community, so they know that philanthropy is with them in funding things that are working and things that are innovative. We've seen the Rakes Foundation do a number of op-eds in support of particular evidence-based practices, things that they see working in their local community, and really stepping up to express their views on ways that the government can work with philanthropy, and we can share examples of that. One of our members, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, is funding a series in The Guardian around homelessness to dive a little bit deeper into who is affected by homelessness and lack of housing. And we've seen a number of our members do that with local media outlets to help bring awareness and education to the problem. And then we have people who have funded direct advocacy efforts. The Campion Advocacy Fund and the California Community Foundation have helped to build capacity in working with coalitions to strategize around direct advocacy and lobbying efforts, as well as funding ballot initiatives that have helped increase the supply of affordable housing. So we'd be happy to connect you with some of these members, and including Melville, who has also worked directly with us to write op-eds to think about expressing our views on the public-private partnership roles. So again, we'd be happy to connect you to some of these members and more examples, and we'd love your examples of how you're working to do broad education and advocacy efforts. But let's get into action. So we have several action steps that we hope that you will consider as you work through what's next. So as we talked about, there's a lot of concern about what's going to happen within the FY18 budget. We think it's really important for philanthropy to continue to voice their concerns, maybe not on specific items, but their concerns that philanthropy can't fill the gap. That philanthropy works best when it partners with government, and also that not all philanthropy is equal. We heard this a lot in our congressional visits, congressional members who are from areas that don't view that they have the same philanthropy as other areas, and that so philanthropy can't be the solution in filling the gaps or helping with cuts that are proposed. So it's really important that also members of Congress and other members hear about how you're funding innovation and how you're building capacity in partnership with government. So we need your public-private partnerships examples, and so sharing them directly but also sharing them with us, as we're often asked for examples. We especially are looking at from examples from states that might be a little bit more conservative, states that are in the South and to the West. So you can send those examples to us about innovative ways that you're working with federal, local, state dollars to create public-private partnerships. We've also been thinking about helping some of our members with creating their own town hall environments. We know that town halls have become an interesting new way of expressing concerns, and there's a lot of members of Congress who are willing to attend those town halls, but there's an opportunity for philanthropy to use its convening power to maybe convene a smaller town hall of your grantees to talk about their concerns, what they're seeing, and create an environment for your elected official where he or she can hear directly from grantees and your concerns and what's going on. And then again, op-eds. We have several ways that we can help you write op-eds, help think about the best placement for op-eds, whether that's local or at the national level. Next slide. Of course, there is funding organizations to do advocacy work. We already talked about sending thank you notes after congressional meetings, and if you are willing to do that, we'd be happy to be in touch with you. As some of you know, that testifying, if you're asked to testify in front of elected officials or policymakers, that's not direct lobbying, and we have several opportunities coming up where we know that several members of Congress want to have hearings, and if you are willing to testify about your experiences with philanthropy, that's a great way to demonstrate your support. And we especially want you to think about identifying people in your community, especially faith-based organizations and business leaders who can set up meetings with Congress or the administration to express their point of view as a private citizen or as business leaders or as faith community leaders about the importance of evidence-based practices. Next slide. So we have one more poll. I know we're running out of time, but we just want to take one more poll to say, how can Funders Together best support your advocacy efforts? You can select all that apply. This will be helpful in our work going forward. We still have some people voting. We'll display those. Of course, if you don't feel like voting now, you can always contact us later. Great. Well, I think there's a lot of interest in receiving special advocacy updates. So we know that when the president's budget comes out in detail, we will plan on doing updates around that. And as I mentioned, we do have talking points on our website, but we'll be updating those. And then one final poll. So this is around how we can support you in supporting your grantees. All right. So we would be happy. I see there's a great overwhelming support for connecting to other funders working on or funding advocacy, and we listed some examples, and we will be tailoring our programs to a lot of these polls. Lauren, do we have any questions before we move into the last section that have come in?
No questions as of yet, but we still have time. So if people have any questions, you can go ahead and put it into. Actually, you know what? We do have one. So Nan had mentioned, apologies, this computer's acting up. Nan had mentioned local or advocacy in local communities. So what are her suggestions for what we should be doing in our local community?
Hi. I think one thing is, we're feeling that we need to get civic leaders more involved in advocacy. So I think, education in the local and supporting education, both doing education and supporting education, funders together can definitely give you the tools. I think this around the impact that the budget cuts are going to have, and I think as Sarah and I said, if they do the 18 budget with the smaller, under the caps, it's going to be really important for people to respond, and that doesn't have to be, that can be done without it being lobbying. So I think things like saying, that philanthropy cannot fill this gap, because that is something, as Amanda also mentioned, that is definitely being thrown around, that the private sector and philanthropy and also state and local government, so it's good for you to talk to state and local government about saying the same thing. I don't think they'll have to be told, but that they're going to fill the gap. I think just really getting engaged and making sure your grantees are hooked up to organizations like the Low Income Housing Coalition, the Alliance, and the other groups that can make it easy for them to advocate, and then working at a leadership level in your community with other people. Amanda probably has better suggestions than I do about that.
Sorry about that. I think we're having a few technical difficulties, but we will be getting back to everybody about some more examples of what we can do at a local level, as well as the federal level for those that are interested. On the screen, we do have some various learning opportunities so that we can continue this conversation around what we can do advocacy and education-wise. We do have our Funders Institute coming up in July in correlation with the National Conference on Ending Homelessness, which we're very excited about. And we do have a new format for that. We also will be having the Advocacy 101 webinar. So if you want to go into a little bit more detail about what you can do as a funder, this will be a really great webinar to attend. We will have more information on the date and the time for that. And we'll be sending an update for that as well to everyone who registered. A couple other groups that we have that focus around not just advocacy, but that's definitely a part of it, is our Funders Together Youth Network. It's an extension of our Foundations for Youth Success group that the community practice that met for the past 2 years. They wanted to do some continued learning, so from that we who started a youth network. And we have our second community of practice, Foundations for Employment and Housing, which is going to be starting up this year as well. So if you're interested in joining either one of those, you can reach out to us at any point and we will get you more information. And for all the United Ways on the phone, we are also looking to start a United Ways Ending Homelessness group. This will be a working group focused around what United Ways can do and get a cohort of various United Ways throughout the country. So those are some of the upcoming opportunities that we have, and if you have any questions about any of those, we'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and I apologize for being on mute before, but we just want to thank you for your participation and know that we are resources as well as we can point you in the direction to any of our partners. We want to thank our partners at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, the National Alliance to End Homelessness. We know that you'll continue to help us in strategizing and keeping us informed, and we thank you so much for your participation today. Have a good rest of your week. And that concludes our webinar.